Did you ever get caught? No, never. Why?
Well, if we see a girl, we're gonna stop. I'm gonna ask her for directions. I'm gonna try and get her over to the car.
I'm a deadly innocent guy.
With ultimate gas, he goes to hell like sex slaves.
So keep on frontin', man.
At age 17, Karla Homolka was living in Ontario, Canada, navigating the typical teenage landscape. Karla and her friends, who called themselves the Exclusive Diamond Club, had a clear goal: to marry older, wealthy men. Karla stood out as the tough girl of the group, known for her edgy remarks and a morbid fascination with death. Karla's rebellious streak became evident when her high school boyfriend moved to the United States. Defying her parents' rules, she bought a plane ticket and flew to stay with him for 2 weeks. Her obsession with death would seep into her everyday life. She would write about it in people's yearbooks and devour graphic novels on abuse, Satanism, and murder. She even owned a pair of real handcuffs. Despite her dark interests, Karla did reasonably well in school, though she struggled with maths and science. In her final year, she was able to reduce her class load to work full-time at a pet supply store. Karla's path started at a pet supply conference she attended with her coworkers, Debbie and Christy. After the conference, Karla and Debbie decided to hit a club and invited a couple of guys back to their hotel room. However, Christy, sensing that the guys were drunk and creepy, told them to leave. Once Christy went to sleep, Karla, ever the rebel, snuck out again and headed to the hotel restaurant. It was there that Karla met Paul Bernardo, a charming young man in his early 20s. From the moment she laid eyes on him, Karla knew she would marry this guy. Their connection was instant and intense. Without hesitation, she invited Paul up to her hotel room, setting the stage for a dark and twisted partnership that would shock the world. Paul was a college graduate with a promising career as an accountant at Price Waterhouse. He drove a flashy sports car, which only added to his allure. Paul showered Karla with fancy gifts, quickly winning over her parents with his boyish looks and polite demeanor. They were so taken with him that they began calling him their weekend son, as he would drive several hours from Toronto to Ontario nearly every weekend just to see Karla. Paul came from a troubled background. His father had abused his sister, and when she spoke up, their mother didn't believe her. The family turmoil deepened when Paul's mother revealed that his father wasn't his biological father. She started referring to him only as the bastard. Despite these challenges, Paul had been determined to make something of himself. He excelled in school, graduated university, and secured a great job. Paul was always social, outgoing, and friendly, traits that made him popular with his clients and with the opposite sex. Before meeting Karla, he had numerous teenage girlfriends, often dating several at the same time. He had a particular interest in taking a girl's virginity, and he preferred rough interactions. His younger girlfriends were easier to manipulate into doing these things for him. However, when he met Karla, he found someone who did it all willingly, and she even had her own pair of handcuffs. When Paul met Karla, it was love at first sight. It was as if she instinctively understood his deepest desires without him having to say a word. Before meeting Karla, Paul had already started groping women at knife point, stopping short of assaulting them. When he confided in Karla about his dark urges, she wasn't shocked at all. She told him she thought it was cool. This twisted approval pushed Paul to escalate his actions, leading to a series of heinous crimes. Karla would write Paul letters and cards filled with messages that had clear sexual undertones. They had now been dating for 2 months, and during this time, Paul had begun assaulting young women in earnest. Most of these assaults targeted young women and girls that he had stalked after they exited buses late in the evening. When he assaulted 15-year-old Libby, this finally prompted police to issue a warning to women in Scarborough, Ontario, advising them to be cautious when traveling alone at night, especially those taking buses. Despite the warning, Paul continued his attacks, with 17-year-old Mary becoming his next victim. Paul continued his spree of assaults, each one more brazen than the last. One brave victim, however, managed to provide the police with enough details to create a composite sketch. The resemblance to Paul was unmistakable, bringing him dangerously close to being caught. As tips poured in, some callers noted the striking resemblance between Paul and the composite sketch, including the wife of one of Paul's friends. Paul had shared some of his sexual preferences with his friend, but when his friend was questioned by the police, he seemed awkward and vague. The police suspected that he might just be trying to collect the reward they were offering. Despite this, the police decided to have Paul come in for an interview anyway. Paul was cooperative, submitting samples for the police and presenting himself as intelligent and well-balanced. He explained that people had been teasing him about looking like the sketch. His demeanor and willingness to cooperate led the police to cross him off the list of suspects. They still sent his DNA samples out, but did not prioritize the results. Paul eventually proposed to Karla, and she accepted. While it's unclear if Karla knew about Paul's assaults, she was aware of his preference for young girls. Paul was bothered by the fact that he wasn't Karla's first, and he often flirted with her younger sister Tammy, even peeping into her room. As Christmas approached, Karla decided she wanted to give Paul a special present, her younger sister. Karla, now working at an animal hospital, had access to various sedating drugs. The couple began experimenting with these drugs, testing their effects by slipping them into Tammy's food and drinks. One evening, they decided to lace Tammy's spaghetti with Valium, a powerful sedative. As Tammy consumed the drug-laced meal, she quickly lost consciousness. Paul and Karla then went into Tammy's room, and Paul gratified himself while Karla watched. After the first incident, Karla began researching other sedatives that might be more effective and have longer-lasting effects. Between work and planning for her upcoming wedding, she studied a pharmaceutical encyclopedia she had stolen from her job. Through her research, Karla decided on Halcyon, a potent sedative she could easily access at the vet clinic. Additionally, she stole a bottle of halothane, an anesthetic typically mixed with oxygen. She determined that to use halothane effectively without access to an oxygen tank, she would need to apply it to a cloth. Karla needed to ensure Tammy was completely unconscious so she could give Paul the best Christmas present ever. On December 23, 1990, the family gathered to celebrate the upcoming holidays. Paul, excited about his new Sony video camera, filmed the festive moments, capturing the joy and laughter of the evening. During the celebrations, Karla discreetly added Halcyon to Tammy's drinks. As the evening went on, Tammy began to feel the effects, feeling drunk and a bit unwell. She went to get some food, hoping it would help. A little later, Tammy, Karla, and Paul settled down to watch a movie together. The sedative soon took its toll, and Tammy became drowsy, eventually falling into a deep sleep. Seizing the opportunity, Karla grabbed the bottle of halothane and poured it over a cloth, preparing to use it as part of their sinister plan. The depraved actions that followed were too horrible to fathom. Karla initially allowed Paul to keep going, but she stopped him when he refused to wear protection. He hit the pause button on his new video camera and told her to shut up. Karla eventually relented and then, on camera, began to follow Paul's instructions on what she should do to her little sister. As Tammy lay unconscious, she suddenly began to vomit. This was a dangerous situation, as consuming food before anesthesia can lead to severe complications. In a panic, Karla turned her sister over, desperately trying to clear her airway. Realizing the severity of the situation, they dragged Tammy back to her room and hastily put her clothes back on. Karla quickly poured the halothane down the drain and hid the pills, attempting to cover their tracks. She then called 911 while Paul began performing mouth-to-mouth resuscitation. The sound of sirens pierced the night, waking the rest of the household. They were about to wake up to their worst nightmare. Tammy's parents followed the ambulance to the hospital, clinging to hope. Tragically, 15-year-old Tammy didn't make it. The loss was devastating for the family. Tammy had a chemical burn on her face from the halothane, but Karla and Paul told the police it was a rug burn from when they dragged her across her room to attempt CPR. The rookie detective assigned to the case never followed up on this discrepancy. The medical examiner ultimately ruled Tammy's death an accident, allowing Karla and Paul to evade immediate suspicion. Tammy's funeral was held just 2 days after Christmas, adding an even deeper layer of sorrow to an already heart-wrenching time for the family. At Tammy's funeral, Paul and Karla wrote a heartfelt letter and placed it inside her casket.
My dearest little sister, words cannot express the deep sorrow and regret that I now feel. You gave me your love and trusted me like your big brother. If I ever caused you any harm or pain, please forgive me. I only wanted the best for you, just for you to be happy and to experience the joys of this world. Tammy, please forgive me. I'll love you from now until eternity, and I'm looking forward to seeing you again once I die. Love, your brother Paul.
Dear Tammy, I have so much to say to you that words cannot express. I've talked to you every night, and you know how I feel about everything. I won't write everything I want to say. You know it already. I love you deeply, and I will hold you in my heart forever. All my love, your big sister, Karla.
The day after the funeral, Karla visited the doctor and obtained a prescription for Halcyon. Given the extreme stress of losing a family member, it wasn't surprising that she claimed to be suffering from insomnia. Karla told Paul that she planned to try again in the summer. However, she was acutely aware that Paul was upset and blamed her for misusing the drugs. Determined to make it up to him, she began plotting her next move. That January, they would abduct a girl and Paul assaulted her while Karla watched. Afterwards, they dropped her off on a deserted road in a remote wooded area. But Karla knew that the girl they dubbed the January girl wouldn't be enough. When Paul was in a bad mood, he would often remind Karla that she was responsible for Tammy's death because of her, quote, stupid drugs. This constant reminder weighed heavily on Karla. In an attempt to please Paul, Karla would sometimes role-play as Tammy, wearing her clothes and a long blonde wig. Paul and Karla would often do this in Tammy's bedroom, capturing the twisted moments on camera. By February 1991, Paul had relocated in order to be closer to Karla. Coincidentally, the assaults in Scarborough stopped around this time. However, the police continued their investigation into the 11 incidents that had occurred over the previous 3 years, though not quite as urgently now. Meanwhile, there seemed to be an increase in assaults near the St. Catharines area, where Karla lived. With the wedding fast approaching, Karla was busy with preparations. Paul and Karla saw an opportunity to make money from the wedding gifts, so they invited many old co-workers and acquaintances, including some they hadn't seen in years. The wedding was set to be a lavish affair with no expense spared. Karla had a luxurious dress, a horse-drawn carriage, and over 100 guests on the list. One of the invitees was 15-year-old Jane, who worked at the pet shop where Karla used to work. Jane was thrilled to reconnect with Karla after so long and was flattered by Karla's attention. It was like the big sister she had never had. During their time together, Karla gave Jane alcohol laced with Halcyon. As the evening progressed, Jane became unconscious. Seizing the moment, Karla called Paul and told him she had a surprise waiting at home for him. It was no coincidence that Jane bore a striking resemblance to Tammy. However, unlike Tammy, Jane survived the incident. The next day, she had no recollection of what had happened to her. She simply believed she was sick from the alcohol, as it was her first time drinking. She thought she was meeting Paul for the first time that morning. She didn't know that she had starred in Paul and Karla's sick home video. Karla was willing to do anything to make Paul happy. Despite her efforts, the next day, Paul was furious. He slapped Karla, angrily questioning why things with Tammy couldn't have gone as smoothly as they did with Jane. In the early morning hours of June 15, 1991, Paul was driving when he spotted 14-year-old Leslie walking down the road. Leslie was a rebellious teenager who had recently found herself in trouble on multiple occasions. She had been caught shoplifting and had been brought home by the police several times after being found drunk. When Leslie failed to come home that night, the police were not as concerned as her mother was, given her history. However, Leslie's mother knew something was terribly wrong. Paul and Karla's wedding on June 29th was as perfect as Karla could have hoped for. They celebrated their union with a lavish ceremony and then headed to Hawaii for their honeymoon. They returned with souvenirs and recordings of their time together in paradise. Among their belongings, Karla had a small newspaper clipping about an incident that had occurred in Honolulu on July 11th. This detail hinted at the depravity that followed them, even on their honeymoon. Karla's parents picked them up from the airport. During the ride home, they discussed the local news. Karla's parents mentioned a horrifying discovery. A fisherman had reported finding body parts encased in cement blocks at Lake Gibson. The police had identified the remains as those of Leslie Mahaffey, the girl who had gone missing a couple of weeks earlier. The police pursued several leads in the murder of Leslie Mahaffey. They had a few suspects with records of violent assaults and worked up a psychological profile of the potential killer. They encouraged Leslie's parents to maintain a media presence to keep the story at the forefront of everyone's minds. As the police focused on Leslie's case, other crimes, like reports from girls about stalking incidents, were deprioritized. A suspicious individual in a gold sports car wasn't seen as important when there was a killer to catch. Meanwhile, Karla and Paul were attempting to groom Jane, buying her nice things and taking her out. However, their patience wore thin as Jane consistently refused to fully participate in any of their disturbing activities. On April 16, 1992, Karla and Paul drove by the local schools, searching for a potential victim. Karla suggested they look around 2 to 3 p.m. when school let out. They pulled into a church parking lot when they spotted 15-year-old Kristen French. Karla got out of the car with a map and flagged Kristen down, asking for directions. Seeing a young couple in the car, Kristen thought nothing of it and approached to help. Suddenly, Paul pulled a knife and forced Kristen into the car. They sped away, leaving only her shoe behind in the church parking lot. Kristen was a good student, known for being polite and responsible. It was completely out of character for her to be late or not call home. By 7 p.m., she was declared missing. Little did anyone know Kristen was still nearby in the basement of Paul and Karla's home, dubbed their new slave. They spent the whole of Easter weekend torturing Kristen. Kristen tried to be obedient and compliant, hoping they would let her go, but they never intended on letting her go. She had seen their faces, knew their names. Kristen had to die.
I never should have gotten to know Kristen because you get emotionally involved with these people and it really hurts. It hurts a lot more because I felt like I was friends with both of them, especially Kristen, because we did so much stuff together. We put makeup on together. We talked, just girl talk when Paul was gone getting us food, and it just made it hurt even more.
On April 30th, 1992, the police made a grim discovery. Kristen's nude body was discovered in a roadside ditch. She was meticulously washed and her hair was chopped off, a deliberate attempt by her captors to eliminate any potential evidence. This discovery was a devastating blow to her family and the community, who had been holding out hope for her safe return. Tips about a gold Camaro Firebird seen near the abduction site led the police down several false trails, diverting their attention from Paul and Karla. The police were collaborating with FBI serial killer profilers. They suggested that the crimes were likely committed by 2 individuals, most likely male blue-collar workers. While some investigators were skeptical about the connection between the case of Leslie Mahaffey and that of Kristen French, others were convinced they were linked. Leslie's body was exhumed for further examination. Meanwhile, local police were following up on various tips. A small-town constable had heard that Paul was a suspect in earlier assaults and recommended he be investigated. Acting on this tip, police visited Paul at home to question him. During the interview, Paul admitted that he had been questioned before and told them that he had willingly provided samples and assisted fully. Paul's openness and cooperative demeanor disarmed the officers. They found it hard to believe that this preppy married man could be the perpetrator they were looking for. Besides, he didn't drive a gold Camaro. Paul told Karla about the police visit, trying to ease her nerves. In response, Karla hid the incriminating videotapes in the attic, concealing them under insulation. The couple had already been discussing changing their names, and this incident gave them the push they needed. Karla chose the surname Teal, inspired by a serial killer character in the movie Criminal Law. The investigation was further complicated by the fact that the Scarborough assaults, stalking reports, and a task force assigned to the homicides were all handled by separate departments and jurisdictions. This lack of coordination sent investigators down numerous wrong paths. To make matters worse, a TV show aired about the abduction and murder, reiterating many of the incorrect details, which only added to the confusion. Over the Christmas and New Year holiday, Paul and Karla were grooming another teenage girl, a friend of Karla's late sister Tammy. Much like with Jane, they showered her with gifts and took her to fancy dinners, trying to win her trust. Despite their efforts, the girl refused to participate in their activities. When Karla suggested they, quote, put her under, Paul became enraged and physically assaulted Karla with a flashlight. He then left for Montreal in a fit of anger. Upon his return, Paul found that Karla's belongings were gone, and the police were waiting for him. He was arrested for assault using a weapon, though he was later released pending a court date. Karla had moved in with her aunt and uncle, telling everyone that Paul had a long history of abuse and that she was a battered spouse who had been too afraid to leave until now. A chance meeting between two investigators at a police training course started to tie everything together. After discussing the Scarborough assaults, they decided to prioritize the DNA results, which led to a match with Paul Bernardo. This breakthrough prompted them to arrest Paul.
Go step back, please.
Today, a 28-year-old man was arrested at his home in Port Dalhousie.
Police have 28-year-old Paul Bernardo in custody.
Paul Bernardo at a home in Port Dalhousie in the Niagara region near St. Catharines.
Paul Bernardo, a prime suspect in the Mahaffey and French killings.
They began interviewing Karla and her family, informing them they suspected her husband in a serious crime. During the interview, the investigators noticed that Karla was wearing a Mickey Mouse watch, like the one that one of the murdered girls had been wearing. When questioned, Karla claimed it was her sister's. Then they began asking Karla about Paul's whereabouts on the dates of the two murders, but she couldn't provide any information. To eliminate her as a suspect, they requested her fingerprints. Feeling the pressure, Karla made an appointment with the defense attorney. This attorney became the only person besides Paul who knew the full extent of Karla's involvement in the horrific crimes. Despite the breakthrough in the investigation, the police were still somewhat off base. The assaults and the murders were being handled by two different investigative teams, leading to a lack of coordination and sharing of crucial information. This meant that the full scope of Paul and Karla's crimes remained hidden. The police concentrated their efforts on Paul, inadvertently giving Karla ideas on how to avoid taking responsibility for any crimes. They leaned into the narrative that she was a battered, scared woman caught in a cycle of abuse and unable to escape. Karla claimed that if she didn't comply with Paul's demands, he would hurt her. The investigators, not realizing how this approach would backfire, continued to question her with this angle in mind. As the police focused on Paul, they had provided Karla with a way to deflect blame, portraying herself as a victim trapped by Paul's violent tendencies. The warrant to search Paul and Karla's house was flimsy, as there was little physical evidence linking Paul directly to the murders. This made the case against Paul more challenging, and the investigators had to carefully consider their next steps. The police had found latent fingerprints on the map used during Kristen's abduction, and once they matched the prints to Karla, the investigation finally gained traction. However, Karla claimed she wasn't a participant in the crime, but a compliant victim. Karla's lawyer sought a deal, proposing that Karla would testify against Paul in exchange for leniency. Karla wanted immunity, but the latent prints made that impossible. The Crown prosecution eventually agreed to a deal with Karla. She would serve 2 concurrent 12-year terms for manslaughter for the deaths of Leslie and Kristen. Initially, it was going to be 10 years, but they added, quote, 2 for Tammy. Karla agreed to provide taped statements to the police, which they would use to prosecute Paul. During the interview, the fact that the assaults were recorded was mentioned, but not heavily focused on. Karla claimed she assumed the police, quote, had the tapes, but they didn't. Unbeknownst to the police, Paul had informed his lawyer about the tapes, who had taken them from the house and hidden them. Karla's plea deal was finalized, so there was no turning back. The tapes remained a secret, ensuring that Karla's involvement in the crimes was not fully revealed. It wasn't until Paul changed lawyers that the tapes came to light. The new lawyer knew that it was unethical to withhold the tapes, so, over a year after Karla's plea deal was finalized, the tapes were handed in. Despite this revelation, the Crown prosecution was obligated to honor the agreement with Karla. However, the tapes would be used as crucial evidence in Paul's trial. By this time, the media in Canada and the US were intensely interested in the case. The judge in the case ordered a media ban, stating that a fair trial for Paul would not be possible without it. Details of the crime were not permitted to be shared with the media for fear of tainting the jury. This presented a very interesting situation regarding freedom of the press, as it highlighted the tension between ensuring a fair trial and the public's right to know. Canadian rules on media bans do not apply to U.S. journalists, as the constitutions of the two countries are different. Because Karla and Paul lived close to Niagara, New York, U.S. news outlets were reporting on the story. U.S. newspaper trucks were turned away at the border, and the police were ordered to arrest any Canadian found with more than one U.S. publication, as this would indicate distribution, and they could be charged with contempt of court. Some believe the ban was put in place to cover up the detail of Karla's plea bargain and light sentence. Despite efforts to stop it, U.S. coverage of the case reached Canada anyway. People smuggled in newspapers and got information from online bulletin boards, which were part of the early internet in 1995. Public outrage grew, with many describing Karla's plea deal as a deal with the devil. Canadian newspapers have appealed such bans. However, Canadian courts have consistently determined that judges have the authority to impose media bans in criminal trials. This issue has gone all the way to the Canadian Supreme Court, which upheld that the court can order publication bans. According to Canadian law, the right of the accused to a fair trial takes precedence over the public's right to know every little detail whenever they want to hear it. The tapes were crucial in securing Paul's conviction. He was found guilty on all charges, 2 counts each of first-degree murder, kidnapping, forcible confinement, and aggravated assault, as well as 1 count of committing an indignity to a human body. He was sentenced to life imprisonment and declared a dangerous offender, making parole highly unlikely. His appeals have been denied, and he has since confessed to additional assaults. The tapes were ordered to be destroyed. They were just too graphic and disturbing to risk being leaked. The lawyer who hid the tapes faced criminal charges as well as professional misconduct. He argued that he kept the tapes because he believed they would help in defending Paul by discrediting Karla. However, the tapes also provided significant evidence for the prosecution. He said there were no clear guidelines for lawyers in such an ethical dilemma. He was charged with obstruction and even creating obscene material of children, alleging that he copied the tapes. He was acquitted of all criminal charges, and the ethical charges were eventually dropped as well. A government inquiry concluded that Crown prosecutors would never have agreed to Karla's plea bargain if they had seen the videotapes. It also determined that many mistakes were made by the police, and there was a significant lack of cooperation. They said that some of Paul's crimes may have been prevented if his DNA sample had been processed and matched more quickly. Karla served her full 12-year sentence and reportedly had an easy time in jail. During her incarceration, she developed a relationship with another inmate and learned French so that they could communicate. Karla expressed a desire to, quote, start her life over in French. Karla was released in 2005 and initially faced conditions regarding her movement and contact with children, but these restrictions were later overturned, much to the dismay of the victims' families. After her release, Karla married her lawyer's brother, changed her name to Leanne Bordelais, and had 3 children. The family moved to Guadeloupe but returned to Canada in 2012. Karla has since attempted to lead a normal life, even volunteering at her children's school. The community was outraged as many were disturbed by her proximity to children. She has attempted to stay out of the media spotlight, claiming she deserves privacy as she considers herself another victim of Paul Bernardo. Paul Bernardo has been consistently kept in segregation for his safety, yet he has still faced assaults and harassment. In 2015, he attempted to remove his dangerous offender status and apply for day parole, but his request was denied. Despite his incarceration, Paul managed to publish an ebook on Amazon titled A Mad World Order, a fiction book not based on his crimes. Public outcry led to its removal from the platform. One review noted, quote, I wouldn't suggest it if you have a weak stomach, but if you can handle something like American Psycho, you can easily read this. Like the character in American Psycho, Paul meets the criteria for narcissistic personality disorder and psychopathy, making him clinically more likely to reoffend. In June 2023, Paul Bernardo was transferred to a medium security prison. The reason for this transfer was not initially communicated to the public, causing controversy and protests from the victims' families. In October 2023, a parole hearing was scheduled for February 2024. At the time of this video's release, we have been unable to confirm the result of this hearing. I appreciate hearing your thoughts and feedback on the video, so please feel free to share your comments below. I'd love to hear suggestions on any other cases you'd like to see covered. As always, thank you so much for watching. Remember, every wrinkle tells a story, and in the wrinkles of crime, we find the truth. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a like and consider subscribing. I'd love to hear your opinions or suggestions in the comments. Thank you for watching, and stay tuned for our next video, and we'll explore another story hidden within the wrinkles in crime.